Hello, my name is Adam Rogers-Johns and I'm doing an MA in African Studies at SOAS. So today I'm going to be talking about the topic which is the same topic as my MA dissertation in social anthropology, which is the dynamics of the commercialization of football in Tanzania. So this follows 2 rounds of fieldwork, spending time with football supporters. The first was 2 years ago, which I conducted for 3 months, and then I recently got back from a 5-week field trip in Dar es Salaam. So, commercialization in Africa is often portrayed as a negative force. So, that's when global corporations come into Africa from the outside and destroy the local market in search of profit. And similarly, the social sciences literature around the commercialization of football, commercialization is seen as a negative force. So that's supporters rejecting the increasing commodification of the game. So things such as rising ticket prices, alienating traditional supporters, and basically rejecting the idea football being turned into a business. However, in the context of football in Tanzania, we see a very different story. So rather than rather than capital being seen as a bad thing, the capital and commercialization is embraced as a positive move towards professionalization and greater legitimacy and ultimately footballing success. So there's very little anti-corporate culture in football in Tanzania, and rather than, as I was saying, in Europe, people rejecting football as a business, in Tanzania it's the opposite, and actually it's the move towards becoming a business which is happening. So just to give some context to football in Tanzania, so if, culture and sport were highlighted as an area by the government post independence in the nation building project. So that was the attempt to create a unified nation. That was the attempt to create a unified national spirit across disparate ethnic groups and a large geographical area. So Kiswahili was central to that, the language in this project of nation building, but also football, and in particular the rivalry between Simba and Yanga. So these two teams for which football in the country is synonymous with this rivalry, and the population of Tanzania can be roughly split 50-50 between supporters of these two teams. So as you can imagine, the fact that everybody supports these two teams creates a lot of everyday debate. They're referred to as Watani Wajad, which means old joking partners. And yeah, so football's arguably the most popular thing in the country. And because everybody's involved in this rivalry, there's a lot of debate and joking amongst supporters about these two teams. And also when the teams play each other, when there's the derby between the two teams in the national stadium, everybody's watching. So it's very much a national rivalry. Both these teams previously operated a supporter-owned model, whereby they relied on their supporter and base for contributions. However, they are now transitioning to a privately owned model. So the way the supporter model works, one of the things that's emerged out of this is the teams are very closely linked to domestic politics. So as I've said, they've always been, from the outset, it's been like a political project, this rivalry. The ruling party has been invested in the rivalry. And basically, because the support for these two teams makes up the majority of the population, the supporter bases can be effectively mobilized for political gain. And also because they rely on contributions from supporters, that includes politicians who support the two teams and rich people. So there's a big link between politics and football, which is arguably not unique to Tanzania. But as I said, now they're transitioning to a privately owned model whereby they're selling shares and becoming companies. And this kind of latest development is arguably inspired by Azam. So Azam are a third team. They're a hyper-commercialized, privately run football club. They were founded 10 years ago, and this was my initial entry point into the topic, because this kind of hyper-commercialization was, as I said, it's kind of it's sharply in contrast to European football sensitivities. where commercialization is generally seen as a bad thing. So Azam is the signature brand of the Bakresa Group, which is a multinational company founded by Zanzibari Salid Saim Bakresa, and the products under their signature Azam brand span from ice cream to soft drinks. They run the ferry to Zanzibar, and they also now provide TV. So you got Azam TV. So it's possible to watch Azam FC Football Club playing on Azam TV, the TV channel, while drinking Azam Cola, this drink. So this kind of like hyper commodification is also reflected in the team's motto, which is Timur Border Bizar Border, or better team, better products. Um, but rather than this kind of over commodification, which is often can seem kind of strange to a Western sensitivity, being rejected, it is embraced, and actually it's praised by also supporters of Simba and Younger also praise this kind of business model, and also see it as a move in the direction of Mpira wa Kisasa, or modern football. So it's like a necessary move basically, and this is reflected in the fact that Azam have built their own stadium. Simba and Younger don't have their own stadiums. They don't have the resources to have their own stadiums, so they play in the national stadium, whereas Azam have built their own stadium. They also have built their own academy, which Simba and Younger don't have an academy. So these things which are seen as necessary for long-term football and success. And Azam showed signs of challenging the status quo. So in 2014, they won the league. And yeah, and this kind of supporters and non-supporters praising Azam, one of the things they're praising is the fact that rather than being dependent on supporters for their money, they're dependent on a company, and therefore they are self-reliant, or economically self-reliant, unlike Simba and Younger. So this kind of economic self-reliance is what Simba and Younger are aiming for when they move away from their relying on supporters towards relying on towards private investment. So commercialization and privatization are rationalized as a positive move towards economic self-reliance. So there's a certain amount of irony in the fact that in order to be self-reliant, the clubs are becoming the clubs are wanting to sell the club and therefore become dependent on private investors. So there's a kind of contradiction in the fact that dependence on investor leads to is in the hope of leading to independence in the future. So there's different kind of dynamics playing out in this self-reliance, and arguably in order to understand this, we have to understand the history of the concept of self-reliance in Tanzania. So kujitegemea, self-reliance, was initially used by Julius Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, to signify self-reliance of the nation again away from European powers in post-independence. And also however, obviously self-reliance is also central to the neoliberal ideology in terms of self-reliance of the individual and self-reliance of the market. So arguably in the case of football and the self-reliance of these teams and the team and the collective, we're seeing both these concepts of self-reliance being played out. So now we're going to look at a case study where we can see how these are played out in context. So this is the takeover of Mo of Simba. So Mo is the CEO of Metal Group, which is another multinational Tanzanian company, and they similarly to Azam, they have their products under the signature Mo brand, named after himself, Mohammed Dawji. They spread from drinks to food, so they're actually one of Azam's main competitors, which is an interesting dynamic. So it's not unusual for these teams to have people putting money into the club. Mo has been a long-term supporter of Simba, so this is nothing new. But what's now new is the formalization of these relationships. So when I first went to Tanzania 2 years ago, these processes were just beginning, and it took a long time. But eventually they settled upon the 51-49% rule. So that's whereby the supporters own 51% of the club. Mo owns a 49% stake. So that's the kind of model they've gone for. And this investment led to an initial period of success. Simba this year reached the quarterfinal of the African Champions League for the first time, and yeah, so obviously people were seen as justified in this commercial model bringing about success on the pitch, which is obviously one of the most important things. But there are different interpretations of these processes amongst supporters. So there are those who believe that Mo has genuine love of the club and he genuinely wants the club to be successful, and they believe that his investment is going to lead towards economic self-reliance, so allow the club to be sustainable and have stability in the future. But there are also those who believe that his interests, he's more self-interested. So he's become very famous since being investing in Simba, more famous than he already was. So certain amount of fame in the country. Also, his products probably sell more; they're advertised more. And because of his position of influence, he's arguably able, and the link between football and politics, he's arguably in a position to get government contracts and this sort of thing. So these people who don't trust Mo point to the fact that his investment in the club is on a kind of, he enables the club in the present but doesn't sustain it, doesn't build for the future. So he buys new players and he pays their wages, and this is what brings about success. But they say that he's not building them a stadium and he's not putting money into the club which will enable the club to function without him. So they're fearful that he could withdraw himself at any time and the club will be left in debt. So he wants the club to be reliant on him. So here we see a limitation to this idea of commercialization and economic self-reliance, because Mo arguably wants the club to be reliant on his capital to succeed. So this political limitation to commercialization we arguably see in other instances where there are other people whose interests are threatened by the commercialization. So the supporters want it because they want self-reliant, they want the club to be better, to be independent, professional, and ultimately to be successful. But there are others who don't want to lose their influence. So we've seen that with Mo, who wants the club to be reliant on his capital. There are also others, such as the Wazé, so the kind of people in charge of the club, the old guard, who for years there's been elections for the clubs and people have been voted in the position of chairman, treasurer, etc. So those people who have voted in, they arguably have a lot to lose by selling the club because they're no longer in a position of authority at the club, or they lose their authority. And with that, they might lose possibilities of kind of ciphering off money, so corruption and benefiting from the club's financial position, but also like the links with politics and just general fame. They kind of lose a lot of their hold. Similarly, as I said, the link with politics means that the ruling party, who are very heavily invested in the club, arguably don't want it to be self-reliant, because if they're no longer in a position of control over the massive support base, who are the majority of the voting electorate, then they arguably lose their influence to somebody else. And there are those who say that the government, CCM, are scared of investors coming in because investors would be able to influence the supporters in other ways potentially. So it's often said that Simba and Yanga hawawezi kujitegemea, they're not able to be self-reliant because of these interested parties. And this is perhaps more true in the case of Yanga, even more so than Simba, who are seen as inherently political. So Yanga referred to as the team of the nation, team ya wananchi, team of the people, because they've got, although the support of the two teams is split roughly in half, Yanga have slightly more support, and they've always had links to politics. This goes back to the Revolutionary Party TANU in the build-up to independence. You held covert meetings at the Yanga clubhouse, and also kind of coincidentally, Yanga wear green, which is the same colour as CCM. And it also goes back to the history of the two clubs. So Yanga, more than Simba, are associated with the working classes and the African working classes, whereas Simba are more associated with Arabs, richer Arabs, basically. So recently Yanga have held elections, and there's very clear desire amongst the supporters and rhetoric in the media from a move away from this amateur system, so mfumo ridha, so that's the kind of collecting of contributions and the typical tembeza bakuli in government, towards a modern system and a professional system, so mfumo rasmi and mfumo wa kisasa. But there's also reservations about whether this is possible in the case of Yanga because of the interested parties, like I've said, so whether that be CCM or those in charge of the club, whether they would allow this to happen. And these political limitations to commercialization are also arguably, we've seen Azam. So as I said, Azam showed signs of challenging the status quo, and they were seen as being outside of domestic political dynamics. But they have kind of failed, and they've kind of definitely fallen behind. They're definitely behind Simba and Yanga. And people's belief, supporters of Azam and other people believe that the reason Azam have been unsuccessful in their kind of project, whereas it looked like they might succeed with this commercial model, is because they've also been subsumed into this system, and it's inevitable that clubs will be influenced by the domestic politics in Tanzania. So they'll say that Azam, the people in charge at Azam, the players, the managers, and even the players themselves are Simba and Yanga supporters. Which is probably true because Azam is a relatively young club, whereas Simba and Yanga are much older. This leads to corruption, allegations of match fixing. So we see in the case of Azam the political limitations to their kind of commercial enterprise, basically. Okay, so in conclusion, I've shown some case studies which look at the intensified commercialisation of a previously less commercialised sector. So football in Tanzania, whereas before the clubs relied on donations from supporters, they're now privatising and becoming more commercial. Have focused on placed an emphasis on how supporters themselves interpret these processes. So this is the lack of anti-corporate sentiment and people embracing this commercialisation as a move towards legitimacy and ultimately success. But we've also looked at some dynamics, such as the political limitations to commercialisation, which we've seen in terms of investors themselves not wanting the clubs to be self-reliant, or the importance of local government and people in charge, and how these limit the commercialisation processes. And that's arguably a dynamic which is applicable in other contexts, and also the importance of understanding local histories. The history of the two clubs, Simba and Yanga, but also histories of concepts such as self-reliance, Kujitegemea in Tanzania, and how processes of commercialization cannot be understood outside of these local dynamics. Thanks a lot.